I'm still trying to figure out how to start this off. I've never done this before, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form some kind of great storyteller. What I am is a woman with a fairly boring job, with the occasional burst of fucking weirdness. I work for a company that does transcriptions. Work is in quotations, because technically we're just freelancers. Honestly, I doubt any of y'all give a single solitary fuck about the ins and outs of my job. So yeah, I'm just gonna jump to the chase here. So most days the audio we get is fairly mundane. Interviews, surveys, just random marketing, or legal things people want to have transcribed for whatever reason. Sometimes we get surprisingly interesting things, like maybe a police interrogation. I've got one of those twice so far, or once, an interview between a lawyer and a potential client. I've heard of other people getting like private audio. By private, I mean apparently some weird-ass motherfucker recorded himself having phone sex with someone multiple times. Also, the audio was of the shittiest quality, so I'm glad I never got any of those. Then there are the days when something truly weird pops up. Weirder than the phone sex thing, I mean. Like spooky weird. I've never gotten one myself, just read about them from other transcribers in our group Discord. The Discord is absolutely not company approved. The company doesn't really like us speaking with each other beyond anything work-related really. But fuck that. As I was saying though, I'd never personally gotten one of those types. Just heard about them from others who had stumbled across them. I have to say, some of the audio logs people have talked about, had to listen to, left us all feeling pretty fucking unnerved. One person ended up quitting entirely after they had the supreme misfortune of taking on a particularly disturbing audio. They refused to give too much detail, claimed they were, and I quote, sparing you all from having nightmares infecting you too. The way they had worded that had left a lot of us creeped out enough and left more than a few of us worried when they fell out of contact without a word. Not just on Discord, a few of us had their socials, and there hasn't been a peep from them since that last message, a message that was left over a year ago. Back on the topic at hand though, my personal winning streak of not having to deal with any of that bullshit came to an exceptionally dramatic end a few days ago. I'll admit in the past, when I first heard about them, I was a little curious about those types of audios in a very morbid way. Any curiosity I had usually had been its death throes after reading about an especially gruesome audio. Everything that happened with the acquaintance I mentioned earlier, that one that completely fucking vanished, any ounce of curiosity I had left was practically beaten to death with a shovel. What I'm saying is, I'd come to the conclusion that they were something I'd really rather not have to listen to. Enough of my rambling. I'm going to post a copy of the transcription below. Yes, that is insanely illegal, which is why I'm not naming the company, myself, or the Discord group. And it is very much why I abandoned the thing even after I finished. I don't think it'll be linked back to my account if someone else picks it up. They're only ever marked as previously abandoned when we pick up a dropped audio, so whoever takes credit for doing it, hopefully, shouldn't face anything. I got points docked for dropping it after the allotted grace time, but I'd rather have as little tying me to this as possible, you know. Anyway, enjoy, I guess. Transcription begins. Male interviewer 1. I know you've been here for several hours now, Mrs. Smith, but we need you to go over this just one more time for us. It will help our investigation immensely and could potentially save lives. Are you ready? Mrs. Smith. Yeah, I guess. Why inaudible? Can I get some water or something? Male interviewer 2. That won't be possible at the moment, Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith. You can't just take a moment to get me some fucking water? Male interviewer 1. I apologize, ma'am. I know you must be thirsty, but we do need to get this done as fast as possible. The sooner it's done, the sooner it can be used to aid us. I give you my word. Once we're finished, I can make sure you get some water. Mrs. Smith. Fine. Yeah, okay. So like I said already, multiple times in fact. Male interviewer 1. We do apologize for that, but it's important, Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith. Right, so, right. I'd had this entire camping trip planned out for a few months now. It was going to be my sister, our cousin, and myself. At the last moment, though, inaudible that had my sister dropping out at the last minute. So it wound up just being me and my cousin. We weren't, the closest, but we got on pretty well enough that it would still be a fun trip. She was closer to my sister, male interviewer 2. So you weren't by yourself on this trip? Mrs. Smith, I literally said my cousin was with me. It was myself and my cousin. So logically I wasn't by myself, male interviewer 2. I understand your frustration, ma'am, but there's no need for yelling. Please try to calm down. Mrs. Smith, calm down, calm down. Have you not been listening? Male interviewer 1. Mrs. Smith, my colleague, misspoke. We're aware this situation has been audible for you, but we have to ascertain that we're understanding everything perfectly. Do you need a break? Mrs. Smith, audible sobbing. Male interviewer 1. Alright, we're going to take a short break. Audio resumes. Male interviewer 2. Are you ready to resume, ma'am? Mrs. Smith, yes, okay. So, as I said earlier, it was just my cousin and I inaudible, and it was only supposed to be a weekend thing, so we didn't bring much with us. There's this diner that she loved, and we were just going to go there for breakfast and dinner. We brought some hot dogs because what's a camping trip without hot dogs, right? Yeah, so we left my place Friday around, I want to say noonish. We got to the campsite around 4 or so. Male interviewer 1, 4 p.m. Mrs. Smith, yes, 4 p.m. Male interviewer 2, please continue. Mrs. Smith, right, okay, so we got to the campsite around 4, and the first thing we inaudible, getting our tents set up. Male interviewer 1, you had separate tents. Mrs. Smith, yeah, you saw them, right? At our campsite, there are these. Male interviewer 2. There wasn't much left of either of your tents, Mrs. Smith, which is why we needed clarification. Mrs. Smith, oh, okay, I hadn't been back to the campsite. I didn't know. Male interviewer 1. We understand, Mrs. Smith. Inaudible, please continue. Mrs. Smith, okay, we had separate tents, like I said, and inaudible had taken us, my sister and I camping all the time when we were younger. So, getting them set up was easy. After that, we went to the diner for dinner. That would have, I think it was around 8. We made it back close to 10. It was dark out. Male interviewer 2. What did you do once you'd inaudible? Mrs. Smith. We started a campfire. We wanted to roast some marshmallows before going to bed. Make some s'mores. It was, at this point, the audio became severely distorted for several minutes before resuming. Mrs. Smith. I don't know what time it was exactly. When I checked my phone, the battery was dead. I remember thinking that was weird because it had been a little over 50% when I went to sleep. But yeah, it was dead. So yeah, it's hard to say the exact time it had been. Interviewer 2. If you had to guess though, what would you say, ma'am? Mrs. Smith. I thought you needed to be perfectly clear about everything. Isn't that what you said? Interviewer 1. We do need to be as precise as we can, Mrs. Smith. However, having the beginnings of a timeline would prove immensely helpful to us. Mrs. Smith. Right, yeah, sorry. If I had to guess, maybe somewhere around 6. Maybe a little before that. It wasn't dawn yet, but it wasn't completely dark either. Interviewer 2. Perfect, thank you, Mrs. Smith. Continue, please. Mrs. Smith. Yeah, I'm sure it was before dawn, and my cousin wasn't an early riser. She'd normally never get out of bed before 10 on the weekends. But it was hearing her that woke me up. Interviewer 1. Hearing her? What do you mean? Mrs. Smith. I heard her talking. I thought at first that inaudible she did that sometimes, but I realized pretty fast that her voice was coming from somewhere in front of my tent. Her tent had been beside mine. Interviewer 1. I see. Could you hear what she was saying? Mrs. Smith. Not really, no. I heard the tone though. It was the same tone she used to use on stray cats and dogs when we were kids. Just, really gentle. Do you know what I mean? I heard her talking like that, and I immediately, though she was doing something stupid like trying to pet a raccoon or something. Interviewer 2. Was that what she was doing, Mrs. Smith? Mrs. Smith. You fucking know it wasn't. You know what? Interviewer 2. Mrs. Smith, do you need to take a break? Mrs. Smith. I don't need a fucking break. I need you to stop asking me these stupid fucking questions. You know exactly what she found. I've told you and told you and told you, but you keep making me fucking repeat it. Making me remember it. I got out of my tent and I saw her and I saw that thing and inaudible. It looked like a deer, but it was so wrong, and looking at it made my skin crawl. But she was trying to help it. She thought it was sick, and she audible sobbing. Interviewer 1. I know this is hard for you, Mrs. Smith. I understand it's incredibly unfair of us to ask you to go through this, but we have no choice. If we want to prevent this from happening again in the future, we have to ask these questions. We have to get a clear picture of what happened. Now please, can you continue? Mrs. Smith. God, fuck yeah, I can continue. I'm so sorry for... Interviewer 1. There's no need to apologize, Mrs. Smith. Your reaction is understandable, given the circumstances. Mrs. Smith. Thanks. Thank you. There was a deer, and she was, crouched in front of it. Really close. And she had her hand held out, and the deer was so wrong. It was so wrong. I don't understand how she could stand to look at it. I don't know what she... Inaudible. Interviewer 2. What do you mean, Mrs. Smith, when you say it was wrong? Could you elaborate, please? Mrs. Smith. Yeah, I can, yeah. It was still a little dark out, but, there was enough light to see that its face was, it was really messed up. I mean, its bottom jaw was just hanging off. Not like its mouth was open or, broken. I mean, it was hanging off. I think the only thing keeping it attached was, oh god, skin and muscle. Just that. The deer would move its head and its jaw would sway like a fucking wind chime. Inaudible. Interviewer 1. Mrs. Smith, do you need the trash can? Mrs. Smith. No, I'm okay. Oh Christ, yeah, I need it. Audio resumes. Mrs. Smith. God, I'm so sorry. Interviewer 1. It's fine, Mrs. Smith. You experienced something traumatic that was a perfectly normal reaction. Mrs. Smith. The only thing normal about any of this. Interviewer 2. Are you well enough to continue, ma'am? Mrs. Smith. Yeah, I'm good. Inaudible was the most noticeable, but there was a lot wrong with it. The way it was standing, the way its body was angled, I could see some of its side. There was inaudible skin missing. I mean, I'm pretty sure I saw part of its fucking ribcage. Something, pale. But, I remember that it looked mobile. Interviewer 2. What do you mean by mobile, Mrs. Smith? Mrs. Smith. I mean, it looked like it was moving. Like it was squirming almost. But that's not quite. I mean, I don't think that's the right word, but it's all I can think of to describe it. It looked wrong. I don't understand she could have seen that thing and felt like it was safe to approach. What was it even standing? It should have been dead. It should have been dead. But it was standing there, inaudible, and she was crouching and talking, and she had a hand held out. I saw its throat bulging. It was bulging, and it was grotesque, like something was moving and pushing, and then... Did she see it? Did she see what it was doing? Interviewer 2. If this is anything like similar reports we've received, it's very likely she didn't, Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith. What do you mean? What does that mean? Interviewer 2. Could you continue, please, Mrs. Smith? Mrs. Smith. No, I can't fucking continue. What does that mean? What the hell does that mean, she didn't? How could she not? Interviewer 1. I realize this is stressful and frightening for you, Mrs. Smith, but we need you to continue, please. Mrs. Smith. Jesus fucking Christ. Fine. Right. I just want to know why this happened. Interviewer 1. I give you my word, Mrs. Smith. Once you've finished giving this final statement, we'll make sure you understand everything. Mrs. Smith. Thank you, really. Okay. Inaudible throat was bulging, like I said. It was bulging and moving, and out of its mouth something, something came out. It looked like an arm, not normal. God, nothing was normal. Nothing was normal about any of it. But the arm, it was. My cousin was maybe 2 feet away from the deer, right? 2 feet, and the arm. The fingers came out first. Out of the deer's mouth came out, wiggling. And they were pale. They shone in the moonlight. And they were wet. Not from blood. It didn't look dark enough. Interviewer 2. What happened next, Mrs. Smith? Mrs. Smith. Next, Jesus fucking Christ, next was the rest of the arm. As pale as the fingers, and it was long and it looked, segmented. But not segmented exactly. It was like too many elbows. At the deer's jaw, it fell off, dropped to the ground, and the arm kept stretching towards, and she just stayed there, crouching. I was screaming then, I remember that. I was screaming at her for her to move, to run fucking something. But she just stayed there. I think she was still talking to the fucking thing. I think she was, and oh God, it grabbed her, the arm grabbed her, and it started pulling her back with it. It was withdrawing back into the deer, and it was bringing her with it, and she never screamed. Not once, not even when audible. I could hear her bones breaking, and she was being folded in half, and she never screamed. And I ran. Oh God, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I fucking ran, I left her. Interviewer 1. I know this has been difficult for you, Mrs. Smith. I appreciate your going over this with us. Would you like that water now, ma'am? Mrs. Smith. God, yes, please. I could really use some water. Male interviewer 1. Absolutely, Mrs. Smith. Can you bring her some water to drink? I believe we're finished now. Male interviewer 2. Of course. Male interviewer 1. Ah, there we go. It's still cold as well. I'm sure that will help. Mrs. Smith. Yeah. I've been talking for hours and yeah, thank you. Male interviewer 1. Make sure to drink it all. It will likely help you feel better. Mrs. Smith. I am, thanks. Several minutes pass at this point in silence. Mrs. Smith. I feel kind of weird, I think. Dizzy. I don't feel so good. I think I need help. Male interviewer 1. You have nothing to worry about, Mrs. Smith. That's perfectly normal. Mrs. Smith. Normal. What? Inaudible? Male interviewer 1. I gave you my word you'd learn what happened. Your statements have been taken, your cooperation noted, and I believe now it's time you found out.